In the high desert of Utah, where the wind sweeps over barren plateaus and jagged red cliffs hold the silence of centuries, there is a story that was never meant to be told. It is the story of a massacre, one so deeply soaked in blood and betrayal that for generations, voices tried to bury it beneath scripture, loyalty, and fear. But whispers linger, carried by the dry air, echoing through abandoned trails where wagons once rolled and families once dreamed of a future. These whispers belong to the dead of 1856, when men, women, and children were erased not by strangers, but by those who claimed to act under the will of God. The tale begins with weary travelers, settlers on the move across an unforgiving land, searching for a place to rest, to survive, to belong. They carried hope in their wagons, but also suspicion, because in Utah, the church was law, and the outsiders were not welcomed with open arms. The Mormon stronghold of the mid-19th century was more than a religious refuge. It was an empire of faith, discipline, and secrecy, built in defiance of the nation beyond the mountains. And it was in this world of fragile alliances and unspoken tensions that the massacre would unfold. Imagine it. The year is 1856. Dust clings to boots, rifles hang heavy against calloused hands, and prayers mingle with dread as dawn breaks over the camps of the weary emigrants. They do not know that eyes are already upon them, watching from the ridges, calculating. To the strangers who passed through this territory, the land felt haunted, not just by hunger and thirst, but by something older, darker, a watchful silence that seemed to carry judgment. And in the days to come, that silence would erupt into violence so shocking it would stain the soil forever. The massacre was not an act of sudden rage, nor was it the work of bandits prowling the frontier. No, this was planned, methodical, and justified by twisted beliefs. Neighbors turned against neighbors. Men cloaked in faith wielded knives and rifles, and what should have been a simple crossing of land became a graveyard for the innocent. Those who lived through the first shots would not live long enough to tell their story. Children, women, even the unborn, they were all silenced in a storm of betrayal. The killers told themselves they were protecting their faith, avenging imagined threats, obeying higher commands. But history remembers them differently, not as guardians of belief, but as executioners. And yet, here is the horror within the horror. For years, the truth of what happened was hidden, denied, and rewritten. Families of the victims vanished from records. Testimonies were silenced under pressure. The official line from those in power was that nothing had happened, or if something had, it was the work of outsiders, renegades, nameless shadows. But the shadows belonged not to strangers. They belonged to the very community sworn to righteousness. Tonight, we open that sealed vault of history. We walk among the wagons that never reached their destination, hear the last cries that echoed against canyon walls, and confront the silence that followed. What drove a people to slaughter those who only wished to pass through? Was it fear, faith, or something darker? A hunger for control that no scripture could excuse? The massacre that unfolded in the Utah desert is more than a crime. It is a mirror, showing us how belief, isolation, and secrecy can twist into something unrecognizable, into blood spilled in the name of heaven. And though the ground has long since hardened over the bones, the questions remain, whispering from the red earth. Who gave the order? And why was this horror allowed to vanish from history? This is not just the story of death in the desert. It is the story of silence, of complicity, and of how entire generations can be taught to look away from the truth. But tonight, we will not look away. We will step back into 1856, to the Utah that the world was not supposed to see, and listen carefully, fearfully to the voices that were buried. For they are still here, waiting to be heard, waiting to remind us of the cost when humanity is lost beneath the weight of faith and fear. To understand the massacre that unfolded in Utah during 1856, we must step back and examine the world in which it occurred. The mid-19th century was a period of rapid expansion across the American frontier, but it was also a time of deep cultural divides, religious fervor, and political instability. The United States was stretching westward, Yet in the deserts and mountains of Utah, another kind of nation was taking shape, a theocratic society built by the followers of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, more commonly known as the Mormons. Driven from state to state by hostility, the Mormons carried with them both trauma and determination. Missouri had expelled them violently. Illinois had seen their prophet, Joseph Smith, murdered by a mob. By the time Brigham Young led his followers into the Salt Lake Valley in 1847, the community was hardened by persecution. They believed themselves to be God's chosen people, and the valleys of Utah, far from the reach of the United States government, became their sanctuary. Here they would establish a kingdom in the desert, where loyalty to the church was paramount and obedience was expected. But survival in such a harsh land required more than faith. It demanded strict control over resources, rigid social structures, and an unbending stance against perceived threats. Outsiders were viewed with suspicion. Travelers who passed through Mormon country were tolerated but not trusted, especially when tensions with the federal government began to rise. Rumors of polygamy, secret militias, and defiance against U.S. authority only deepened the divide between Utah and the rest of the nation. The Mormon community saw themselves as a people under siege, and this siege mentality would play a crucial role in what was to come. The mid-1850s were especially volatile. Utah was governed as a U.S. territory, but in reality, Brigham Young ruled as both prophet and political leader. His word was law, both spiritual and civil. Under him operated not only the church but also secretive organizations like the Danites and the so-called Avenging Angels, groups allegedly tasked with protecting the faith by silencing dissent and rooting out threats. Though their existence was often denied, whispers of their activities haunted the surrounding territories, giving the Mormons an aura of both fear and mystery. The emigrant trails that cut through Utah were arteries of the nation's expansion. Thousands of settlers moved westward toward California and Oregon, passing through Mormon territory. Some were welcomed with trade, others with cold stares, and a few with hostility. Tensions rose whenever emigrants openly criticized the church, accused its leaders of tyranny, or flaunted their Gentile ways. And always in the background loomed the question of allegiance: would the Mormon settlements bow to Washington, or would they carve out a sovereign kingdom in the desert? Against this backdrop of suspicion, faith, and survival, groups of immigrant families from Arkansas, Missouri, and other states began their long trek westward. They brought with them livestock, wagons, and the weary determination of those chasing new beginnings. But for the Mormon settlers, these outsiders were not merely travelers. They were reminders of past persecutions, of mobs that had burned their homes in Missouri and spilled their prophet's blood, old grudges mixed with fresh paranoia, and in the desert air, every insult carried the weight of history. It is important to understand the culture of obedience that defined Mormon society at this time. The church was not simply a place of worship. It was the axis around which all of life revolved. Sermons carried warnings of vengeance, of blood that must be spilled for sins, of loyalty tested by fire. Children were raised to see outsiders as potential enemies and dissenters within their own ranks as traitors. The doctrine of blood atonement, a belief that certain sins could only be forgiven through the shedding of blood, lingered in the minds of many believers. Whether or not this doctrine was officially sanctioned, its echoes resonated across the settlements, shaping how violence could be rationalized as divine justice. The geography itself contributed to the sense of isolation and danger. The valleys and mountains of Utah were remote, far removed from the protection of federal troops or the scrutiny of outside newspapers. What happened in the desert often stayed in the desert. A wagon train that disappeared, a stranger who never reached their destination. Such vanishings could be explained away by the brutal realities of frontier life. Starvation, sickness, or attacks by native tribes were easy scapegoats. Few would suspect that their fellow Americans, cloaked in the righteousness of faith, might be the true culprits. Meanwhile, within the Mormon community, secrecy was a survival strategy. They had learned through years of persecution that openness invited attack. Information was tightly controlled, outsiders were carefully watched, and loyalty was constantly tested. Leaders preached that betrayal from within was more dangerous than threats from without, and so members were conditioned to obey first and question never. This culture created a fertile ground for silence, complicity, and the suppression of uncomfortable truths. By 1856, the political climate in Utah was reaching a boiling point. Rumors circulated that the U.S. government planned to send troops to bring the territory under tighter control. Brigham Young and his followers braced for conflict, preparing spiritually and materially for what they saw as another potential persecution. Within this atmosphere of fear and readiness for violence, the arrival of immigrant groups from the East took on new significance. Were these travelers simply settlers on their way to California, or were they spies, saboteurs, perhaps even instruments of the government sent to undermine the church? To the Mormons, the line between civilian and enemy blurred dangerously. The social fabric of frontier life added another layer of tension. Resources were scarce, and immigrant wagon trains passing through could strip grazing land, buy up food, supplies, and strain the fragile economy of isolated settlements. Resentments built as locals saw outsiders taking what little could be spared. Some immigrants, frustrated by the cold reception, returned the hostility with sharp words or reckless behavior. Tales spread quickly of insults hurled at church leaders, of boasts about past violence against Mormons, of arrogance displayed in the shadow of Zion. Whether true or exaggerated, these stories fueled the belief that the travelers were not just strangers but enemies of the faith. Thus, the massacre that would come was not born in a vacuum. It was the product of decades of persecution, years of isolation, and months of mounting paranoia. It was shaped by a culture that prized obedience, cloaked violence in righteousness, and saw outsiders not as fellow citizens but as looming threats. It was also enabled by geography, by the desolate valleys that could swallow secrets whole, by the vast distances that separated Utah from the gaze of Washington and the rest of the nation. In this crucible of faith, fear, and survival, the stage was set. Wagons creaked over rocky soil, oxen trudged through dust, and settlers looked to the horizon with weary hope. But on the ridges above them, unseen eyes watched, and whispers carried through the sagebrush. The emigrants could not know that they had stumbled into a land where history itself was being rewritten, where silence was as lethal as any rifle, and where their journey would end not with new beginnings but with graves unmarked and stories untold. The Utah of 1856 was a land divided, both from the nation and within itself. It was a place where the faith of a people, tested by years of violence and exile, had hardened into something that could justify horrors. And it was in this land, amid red earth and endless sky, that the emigrant families met their fate. The massacre to come would not only claim their lives, but would also reveal the dark heart of isolation, secrecy, and absolute power. The emigrant wagons moved steadily across the harsh Utah desert, wheels groaning under the weight of possessions, children peering out from canvas coverings, and adults scanning the horizon for danger. They had traveled hundreds of miles already, facing hunger, sickness, and exhaustion. The families from Arkansas, Missouri, and other states carried with them not only livestock and wagons, but also the fragile hope of a new beginning in California. Yet as they entered Mormon country, that hope would be met with suspicion, resentment, and finally with silence that turned deadly. At first, the tension was subtle. The immigrants passed through small Mormon settlements, stopping for supplies, water, or grazing land. They found the locals distant, sometimes cold, and occasionally hostile. Prices for food were higher than expected, and sometimes supplies were outright refused. When the immigrants tried to trade cattle or goods, they were met with suspicion rather than welcome. Stories began to spread among the travelers, stories of whispered threats, of strange looks, of people who warned them to move quickly and not linger. The desert wind carried unease, though the emigrants did not yet know that they were walking into history's shadows. Small confrontations soon emerged. A wagon train passing too close to farmland, a comment made too loudly in frustration, a naive child wandering where they should not, all of these became sparks on dry tinder. According to later testimony, some immigrants allegedly boasted about their connections to Missouri, even claiming ties to those who had persecuted the Mormons in the past. Whether these words were truly spoken or twisted by rumor, they ignited old wounds among the settlers who remembered blood spilled decades before. The past was not forgotten, and in these valleys, memory itself was a weapon. As the wagon train moved deeper into Utah, they began to sense they were being watched. Figures appeared on ridges in the distance, sometimes riders, sometimes lone silhouettes against the sun. At night, the emigrants heard faint sounds, the clatter of hooves far off, the echo of movement among rocks, the flicker of campfires that were gone by dawn. Families huddled close around their own fires, whispering prayers, unsure if the danger came from native tribes, wild animals, or something else entirely. The desert, once empty and vast, felt suddenly claustrophobic, as though unseen eyes closed in with each passing mile. Then came the first signs of deliberate hostility. Livestock, disappeared cattle driven off in the night, horses gone from their picket lines. A young boy sent to fetch water claimed he saw riders in dark coats moving swiftly across the horizon before vanishing into the sagebrush. When the emigrants sought help from nearby Mormon settlements, they were met with shrugs, silence, or words that chilled more than comforted. Best to move along, best not to stay here long. The message was clear, though never spoken aloud. You are not welcome. You should not be here. The tension reached its breaking point in the valley later known as Mountain Meadows. Surrounded by ridges and hills, the emigrants set up camp, exhausted and uneasy. The meadow offered grass for livestock, water for families, and a place to rest before the next stretch of desert. Yet the geography also made them vulnerable, a bowl of land where watchful eyes could see every movement, where escape routes were limited and where danger could close in from every side. What should have been a refuge became a trap. It began at dawn. Shots cracked across the meadow, tearing through canvas and waking families in panic. Men scrambled for rifles, women pulled children into wagons for cover, and livestock stampeded in terror. The emigrants realized quickly that they were under attack, yet the enemy was not clearly seen. Gunfire echoed from the ridges, smoke drifted from hidden positions, and figures moved like shadows among the rocks. Some survivors later recalled the terror of not knowing where death came from, of bullets snapping from all directions as if the desert itself had turned against them. For days, the emigrants held out. They dug shallow trenches behind wagons, used boxes and barrels as barricades, and rationed food and water while waiting for relief. The attackers did not storm the camp directly, but circled like wolves, cutting off escape and exhausting their prey. Night brought silence, broken only by the cries of children and the faint sound of movement beyond the camp's edge. Every morning, the emigrants woke to renewed gunfire, each day thinning their numbers further. Hope ebbed away with every fallen father, every wounded child. In the midst of despair, a strange moment came. Emissaries approached the emigrant camp under a flag of truce. Dressed as settlers and speaking with calm authority, they offered a way out. Lay down your arms, they said. Hand over your weapons, and we will escort you to safety. Exhausted, wounded, and desperate to save their families, the emigrants hesitated. Trusting strangers in such a place felt perilous, yet the promise of escape outweighed the certainty of death. After long hours of deliberation, they agreed. The scene that followed was chilling in its precision. The emigrant men were separated from the women and children. Each group was assigned a Mormon escort who walked beside them as they left the meadow. For a brief moment, relief filled the air. Perhaps salvation was near. Perhaps the nightmare was ending. But then, in an instant, the signal was given. Rifles turned not outward, but inward. The escorts who had promised safety raised their weapons against those they walked beside. Shots thundered, screams filled the valley, and blood soaked the dry earth. Women clutched children only to fall together. Men cried out in shock as bullets tore through them at point-blank range. In minutes, the meadow was transformed into a graveyard. When the smoke cleared, silence descended. Bodies lay scattered across the grass, wagons stood abandoned, and the cries of children echoed faintly. Some very young children, too innocent to be considered threats, were spared, taken away to be raised in Mormon households. But for the rest, there was no mercy. The emigrants' belongings were divided, their livestock taken, their story buried. Beneath secrecy, the meadow that had promised life became a place of death, and the massacre was sealed in silence. In the days that followed, those involved worked swiftly to cover their tracks. Graves were dug hastily, possessions hidden or redistributed, and orders given not to speak of what had happened. Within Mormon settlements, whispers spread, fragments of truth mingled with rumors, creating a fog of uncertainty. Official accounts shifted blame to native tribes, insisting that the emigrants had fallen victim to savages of the desert. Yet those who had seen the faces of their attackers knew otherwise. The killers had not worn feathers and paint. They had worn coats, carried rifles, and spoken with the voices of neighbors. The massacre did not end with death. Survivors, few as they were scattered, some children absorbed into households, their origins concealed. The memory of the victims was deliberately erased, their names buried alongside their bodies. For the immigrants' families back east, silence was all that returned. Letters stopped. News never came. Loved ones vanished into the vast West, swallowed by a story that would be denied for years to come. What made this tragedy more haunting was not only the brutality, but the complicity. Dozens knew of the massacre, those who gave orders, those who fired shots, those who remained silent afterward. Yet for years, no one spoke openly. The culture of secrecy, the fear of punishment, and the weight of loyalty ensured that the truth remained hidden. Children who had been spared grew up among strangers, their identities reshaped, their pasts obscured, and the meadow, once soaked with blood, returned to silence as grass grew tall and winds swept clean the traces of violence. But history does not stay buried forever. Fragments began to emerge, testimonies whispered, stories recorded in diaries, questions raised by outsiders. The massacre, once hidden, slowly surfaced in public consciousness, though always clouded by denial, blame, and controversy. The truth was fractured, incomplete, but enough to reveal the horror of what had taken place. It was not a tale of savages attacking innocents, but of neighbors turning on travelers, of faith twisted into justification, of fear erupting into slaughter. The emigrants who set out with hope in their hearts never reached their destination. Their journey ended in betrayal, their lives stolen in a place they had never intended to stay. And though time moved on, the meadow remained a silent witness to what human fear and zealotry can create. It was here, in the shadow of faith and isolation, that families were unmade, innocence was destroyed, and history was stained with blood that the desert could not wash away. News of the massacre did not spread immediately. For weeks and months afterward, the story remained contained within the valleys of Utah. Mormon leaders encouraged silence, and those who had taken part carried the weight of secrecy. To outsiders, the emigrants had simply disappeared into the expanse of the American West, swallowed by its dangers, as so many other travelers had been. But whispers began to move eastward, rumors of a wagon train, of violence, of betrayal. Letters surfaced, vague and fragmentary, suggesting that something unspeakable had occurred. Slowly, the wider public began to ask, what had happened in the Utah desert? Within Mormon communities, reactions were complex and deeply divided. Some saw the massacre as a tragic necessity, a preemptive strike against outsiders who threatened their faith. Others spoke only in hushed tones, their consciences burdened by the enormity of what had been done. Parents told children never to mention the meadow. Families who had taken in the surviving children raised them as their own, sometimes erasing their true names, sometimes allowing the past to linger like a shadow in family lore. For many, silence was the only possible shield against shame or retribution. When outsiders pressed for explanations, leaders at first pointed to native tribes. It was convenient to suggest that Paiutes or other groups had fallen upon the emigrants in a brutal ambush. For decades, Native Americans had already borne the weight of blame in countless frontier killings, so few questioned this claim at first. Yet cracks soon appeared in the story. Survivors too young to fully comprehend but old enough to remember recalled white faces among the attackers. Ranchers passing through the area noticed strange inconsistencies in the graves. historians piecing together scattered evidence began to see that the truth was far more complicated than the official version. The federal government, already distrustful of Mormon isolationism, seized upon the incident as evidence of rebellion within Utah territory. Newspapers across the United States carried lurid accounts, some exaggerated, others uncannily close to the truth. Editorials thundered against the Mormon menace, portraying the massacre as proof that the settlement in Utah was lawless, dangerous, and hostile to the Union. Politicians debated whether stronger measures were needed to control the territory, and anti-Mormon sentiment, already simmering, flared into open hostility. For many Americans, the massacre became not only a tragedy, but a symbol, a reason to fear and mistrust an already marginalized community. Yet within Utah itself, the reactions were more intimate. Some settlers justified the massacre in theological terms, suggesting that God had demanded the blood of the emigrants. Others believed the killings were carried out not from divine command, but from fear of betrayal, from old grudges dating back to Missouri and Illinois, from the paranoia that isolation breeds. Still others admitted, quietly and with sorrow, that nothing could justify the slaughter of families, that faith had been used as a mask for vengeance. This tension between justification and guilt would echo for generations, shaping the way the massacre was remembered or forgotten. Among the emigrants' families back east, grief turned quickly into outrage. Letters arrived at distant farms and towns reporting that loved ones had vanished, that no further news would come. Rumors trickled in about a massacre, though details were often unclear. Families begged for answers, petitioned the government for investigations, and demanded accountability. For them, the silence from Utah was unbearable. Their loved ones had vanished into the wilderness, their graves unknown, their belongings scattered. What remained was anger, sorrow, and the haunting question: why? Doctors and ministers who later heard accounts of the massacre struggled to comprehend it. From a psychological standpoint, some suggested that isolation, fear, and indoctrination had combined to push ordinary men toward extraordinary violence. Ministers warned that unchecked zealotry could twist faith into a weapon. Doctors who examined the few surviving children saw signs of trauma, nightmares, confusion, and the scars of memory that could not heal. Though the language of modern psychology did not yet exist, observers sensed that the massacre was not only a crime of blood, but a wound upon the human spirit. The press, eager for sensational stories, painted the event in stark colors. Illustrations depicted the meadow as a place of chaos and savagery, often exaggerating or fabricating details for dramatic effect. Yet beneath the exaggeration lay a kernel of truth. Families had indeed been slaughtered, children orphaned, and a wagon train erased from history. The papers demanded justice, naming prominent Mormon leaders as suspects, speculating about secret orders, and fueling public outrage. For readers in distant cities, the massacre became less about the emigrants themselves and more about the clash between a strange frontier faith and the American nation. It was framed as a struggle between civilization and fanaticism, between loyalty and rebellion. Within Mormon settlements, however, the massacre's aftermath was not so easily reduced to headlines. Children who had been spared grew up with fractured identities, some learning in adulthood that the families who raised them were not their own. The killers themselves lived with the memory of what they had done, some retreating into silence, others hardening into defiance. Whispered conversations in kitchens and barns hinted at guilt, at nightmares, at the inescapable stain of bloodshed. Communities carried the knowledge like a shared burden, a secret that could not be fully spoken yet never forgotten. For historians of the period, the massacre became a case study in how fear and isolation shape societies. Utah in the mid-19th century was cut off from the rest of the nation, a theocratic enclave where religious and political authority blurred. Under such conditions, dissent was dangerous, outsiders were feared, and loyalty was demanded above all. The massacre revealed what happens when these forces converge, when suspicion hardens into hatred, when authority goes unchecked, and when the boundaries between faith and violence dissolve. Even years later, when the truth began to surface in Trials and testimonies, the reactions were divided. Some demanded harsh punishment, calling the massacre one of the most shameful episodes in American history. Others continued to deny, minimize, or deflect responsibility, insisting that outsiders could never understand the pressures the community faced. The story of the massacre was never simply about what happened in 1857. It was about how societies remember, how they explain, and how they justify acts that defy comprehension. In the end, the massacre left a scar not only on the meadow where it occurred, but on the collective memory of America. For the emigrants' descendants, it became a tale of betrayal and grief. For the Mormon community, it was a source of shame, controversy, and internal conflict. For historians, it was a reminder of how violence can be erased, denied, or reshaped in the telling. And for society as a whole, it was a mirror reflecting the darker side of human nature, the part that can convince ordinary people to commit extraordinary crimes when driven by fear, zeal, or the weight of history. The morning of September 11, 1857, dawned bright and deceptively calm over the valley known as Mountain Meadows. The emigrant camp, weary from days of siege, was quiet, its inhabitants exhausted and desperate. Their wagons had been circled for protection, but ammunition was running low. Families huddled together, mothers clutching children, fathers staring out toward the ridges where shadows moved. They had endured days of isolation, hearing only distant gunfire and the unsettling silence that followed. Some believed negotiations might bring salvation, others feared the end was inevitable. Hope clung thinly to the belief that someone would intervene before the last bullet was fired. Then came the approach of men waving a white flag. They carried themselves with solemn dignity, their faces grave, their voices calm. They spoke of truce, of safety, of escorting the emigrants to protection. They promised water, food, and passage if only the emigrants would lay down their arms. Exhausted, the travelers weighed the words. Could they trust these men? Yet what choice remained? To stay in the camp meant slow death by thirst, by starvation, by bullets from unseen hills. To accept the offer meant surrendering their weapons and placing their lives in unfamiliar hands. In the end, desperation overcame suspicion. The emigrants were gathered into small groups, organized by families. Men were escorted first, marched in lines, each separated under guard. Women and children followed behind, some clutching blankets, others carrying small bundles of belongings. Infants cried, their voices shrill in the dry air. Survivors later recalled the strange quiet, the heavy stillness that fell as they walked, away from their wagons, leaving behind the fragile circle that had been their last defense. In that moment, it must have felt like a fragile crossing between despair and deliverance. But deliverance never came. As the lines moved through the meadow, the signal was given. Some accounts say it was a gunshot, others recall a shouted command. What is certain is the sudden eruption of violence, swift and merciless. Guards turned on the emigrant men, firing at close range, cutting them down where they stood. Women screamed, clutching their children, before being struck with gunfire or blades. The meadow that only moments earlier had seemed filled with fragile hope became a place of horror. The cries of the dying echoed across the valley, mingling with the frantic wails of children and the heavy, sickening silence of betrayal. Witnesses spoke of the brutality in hushed tones long after. Men were shot at point-blank range, their bodies falling into the dust. Women, some begging for mercy, were slain as they tried to shield their children. The attackers, men who had promised safety, struck with the cold efficiency of soldiers following orders. In the chaos, children under the age of 7 were spared, torn from their mothers' arms even as the women fell. Those children would later be scattered among Mormon families, their past erased, their futures rewritten. For the others, men, women, older children, there was no escape. The meadow was transformed into a graveyard in the space of an hour. The horror did not end with the killings. Bodies were stripped, possessions taken, wagons were rifled through, livestock seized. What had once been a hopeful caravan bound for California was reduced to silence, to broken shapes lying in the dust, to the smell of blood baking under the Utah sun. The meadow, once a resting place for travelers, became a scar upon the land. And as quickly as it had begun, the violence was over. The attackers, grim and wordless, began covering their tracks. Shallow graves were dug, stones scattered to hide the evidence. Yet no stones could conceal the enormity of what had been done. Accounts suggest that even among the attackers, silence was heavy. Some carried out their orders with cold resolve, convinced of necessity or divine will. Others faltered, their hands trembling, their faces pale as they struck. There were those who looked away as the killings unfolded, unable to bear the sight, yet complicit by their presence. Afterward, men returned to their homes carrying not only spoils of the massacre but the weight of a secret that would shadow them for the rest of their lives. Families greeted them in silence, knowing instinctively that something monstrous had occurred. For the children who survived, the climax of that day was not only the loss of family, but the erasure of identity. Torn from parents, handed to strangers, they grew up under new names, told fragments of a past they could barely recall. Some remembered the screams, the flashes of violence, the feel of being pulled away. Others recalled nothing but the emptiness left behind. Yet all of them lived as reminders of the massacre, silent witnesses carried into adulthood, their lives shaped by the horror they could never escape. The meadow itself bore the scars. For years afterward, travelers passing through spoke of bones surfacing after rains, of shallow graves disturbed by animals. The earth seemed unable to hold the weight of what had been buried there. Silence lingered in the air, a stillness that unsettled even those who knew nothing of the massacre. Locals avoided the place after dark, whispering that the meadow was haunted by the cries of the slain. Whether superstition or the lingering weight of memory, the land itself became a participant in the story, carrying the echo of blood and betrayal. For the outside world, the climax came not in the moment of violence itself, but in the revelation of betrayal. To learn that emigrants had been lured from safety under false promises, that families had walked willingly into death believing they were being rescued, struck a deeper horror than even the killings alone. It was not simply murder, it was a calculated act of deceit, an exploitation of trust, a crime that cut to the core of human vulnerability. The massacre was not an accident of war, not the chaos of battle, but an orchestrated slaughter delivered with chilling precision. This climax, the moment when hope was extinguished and trust turned into a weapon, remains one of the most haunting aspects of the event. It forces us to confront not only the capacity for violence, but the fragility of belief, the way desperation can blind us, and the terrible consequences when mercy is used as a mask for murder. In that meadow in 1857, humanity revealed both its deepest faith and its darkest betrayal, leaving behind a story that would haunt not only the survivors, but the nation itself. The killings ended, but the echoes did not. Families of the emigrants would never see their loved ones again, never know the truth of their final moments until years later. Communities that carried out the massacre would live in the shadow of what they had done, their silence both a protection and a prison. And the meadow would stand as witness, an open wound on the landscape of the American West. In the climax of this story, violence achieved its terrible end, but memory ensured it would never truly fade. Long after the dust of 1857 had settled, the mountain meadow stood silent, its grass growing back, its streams running as though nothing had ever happened. Travelers passed through, some unaware of the massacre, others whispering the story with unease, as if speaking too loudly might summon the spirits of the slain. The land itself seemed reluctant to forget. Bones surfaced after heavy rains, pale against the dark soil, silent reminders that history had tried and failed to bury. Crows circled overhead, and some swore the place never sounded the same, that the wind moved differently there, carrying echoes of screams too old for anyone alive to have heard. The children spared that day grew into adults carrying fractured memories. Some barely recalled faces of mothers they would never see again. Others spoke of flashes, gunfire, cries, a hand pulling them away. Adopted into Mormon families, they lived under new names, their past erased. Yet the truth followed them like a shadow. Whispers of their origins surfaced, sometimes as hushed confessions, other times as cruel reminders. To be both survivor and orphan was to inhabit two worlds and belong to neither. Their lives became living evidence, silent witnesses walking among communities that had tried to silence the story forever. For decades, the massacre was spoken of only in fragments. The official narrative was distorted, softened, sometimes denied outright. Blame shifted onto native tribes, onto nameless outlaws, onto anyone but those who had carried out the killings. The silence was not only for protection, but also for survival. To admit the truth was to admit complicity, to risk unraveling the fragile fabric of a young community struggling for legitimacy. Yet silence has its own weight, and the deeper it is buried, the heavier it grows. By the time whispers began to surface in newspapers, the event had already begun to transform into legend, half remembered and half denied. Historians would later uncover documents, testimonies, fragments of letters, piecing together what had been hidden. But even in the clarity of facts, the shadow of mystery remained. Why did ordinary men, farmers, fathers, neighbors become executioners? Was it fear, zealotry, the intoxicating belief that violence could serve divine will? Or was it something simpler, more terrifying, the ease with which humans justify the unthinkable when convinced they are threatened? These questions echo through time, unanswered, because to answer them fully would be to look too closely at what we all might be capable of in moments of desperation or obedience. For the descendants of both the emigrants and the attackers, the meadow remains a scar. Families visit the site, laying flowers on memorial stones erected long after the massacre. Some come seeking closure, others seeking forgiveness, though forgiveness is hard to find where trust was weaponized so completely. Mormon leaders would eventually acknowledge the massacre, naming it as a tragedy, a sin, a horror that should never have been. Yet no words, no ceremonies, could return the dead or erase the betrayal that defined their final moments. History, once denied, could only be carried forward as a warning. The meadow itself still holds power. Those who camp nearby speak of an unease that settles over the valley as night falls. Horses grow restless, dogs whimper, fires crackle strangely. Some claim to see figures in the distance, shapes that vanish when approached. Others report hearing voices in the wind, faint but distinct. Cries for help, the sound of children wailing. Prayers cut short. Skeptics dismiss these as tricks of imagination, echoes shaped by knowledge of what happened. Yet for those who have stood in the meadow, the sensation is undeniable. The place remembers. The silence is not empty. It is filled with the weight of what it has witnessed. In this silence lies the deepest horror. Violence itself is brutal but swift. Silence lingers, seeping into generations, haunting memory, shaping identity. The Mountain Meadows Massacre did not end with the killings. It lives in the hesitation of those who told the story, in the guilt carried by descendants, in the uneasy relationship between faith and violence. The land is both a grave and a mirror, reflecting the darkest capacities of belief and the fragility of trust. To stand there is to feel history pressing close, not as distant fact, but as something alive, breathing, unwilling to be forgotten. And so, the story remains suspended between history and haunting. Scholars argue over details, documents emerge, but the essential truth resists full clarity. Perhaps it is better that way. For in its obscurity, the massacre forces us to confront not only what happened, but why such things happen at all. It asks us to look beyond the meadow, into ourselves, into the unsettling possibility that under certain conditions, betrayal and brutality are closer than we care to admit. The massacre is not simply a tragedy of the past, it is a warning etched in blood, a reminder that the boundary between faith and fanaticism, between community and cruelty, is perilously thin. As the sun sets over Mountain Meadows today, the valley glows gold, deceptively peaceful. Grass sways in the breeze, water flows clear, and the hills cast long shadows. To the casual eye, it is beautiful, serene, untouched. But for those who know its story, the beauty is laced with dread. Beneath the earth lie remains of families who never reached their destination, their dreams cut short by betrayal. Above, ground, silence reigns, yet the silence speaks. It tells of hope turned to horror, of trust turned to treachery, of voices lost but not gone. And as long as the meadow endures, so too will the echoes of that September morning unanswered, unquiet, unforgettable.